today at the National Assembly with the President, Ricardo Alarcon. Good morning, Mr. President.
Good morning. Morning. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about who is Ricardo Alarcon.
Eh, well, I am the son of Roberto and Mercedes. That's the most precise definition. My father and my mother. I was born in Havana, Cuba. I studied at Havana University. I participated as a student in the struggle of our people for its liberation against the Batista regime. After the victory of the revolution, I finished my career at the university and I joined the foreign ministry. I was sent to New York as a permanent representative to the UN. I lived there for 14 and a half years. Then I returned to Cuba. I was elected a member of the National Assembly and later as its chairman, which is my current situation. In a nutshell, that's
For those of us who doesn't know who Batista was, what was Cuba like at the time that Batista was in power and you were a student?
Well, to begin with, Cuba was not really yet a sovereign nation, was not an independent country until January 1st, 1959. Its economy was practically totally under the control of a number of U.S. Corporations. It's a long history that can be summarized by the fact that the U.S. Always, or rather some people in the U.S., since the very beginning of both your history and our history, had intended to take control over Cuba. That comes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson, who advocated for that until his last minute of his life, and many others. The U.S. did intervene in the Cuba's effort to gain independence from Spain, intervene all along that struggle of 30 years. On the one hand, by supporting Spanish troops in Cuba, who found logistical support in U.S. ports to attack the Cuban patriots over the island, to block the island, using the U.S. territory as their rear guard base, by equipping and training their navy in the U.S., and on the other hand, the U.S. authorities persecuting and suppressing any effort by the Cuban emigres, who were a substantial part of the Cuban population. That's another legend that is not usually mentioned in the big media in America. And then, at the end, by intervening themselves, the U.S. troops, and occupying Cuba. That was the first of four military interventions that we suffered in the 20th century, before the Cuban Revolution victory. Then, for all practical purposes, Cuba, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 not only signified a social transformation, socialism, and all that, but also national independence. The Batista regime, in addition to that, was a very repressive regime that closed down every union, workers' union, or every students' association, that created, obviously, a very large level of opposition by the people, and a confrontation that led to about 20,000 people that were killed by that regime. Then we won independence and freedom for the first time really in our society. The rest is known by the audience.
Why do you consider that to be the real freedom, the real independence, the revolution of 1959, and that's, say, when Spain left in 1898? Why is that the real one? Why is that the one that is in the record books, in your mind?
Well, first of all, the Spaniards were going to live in around that date, 1898, because they were going to be expelled. They were being expelled by the Cubans. There is a famous quotation from the governor general of Spain in Cuba in those days, when the Queen of Spain, in exchange with the Queen, Her Majesty, the Queen of Spain, who was at that time the head of the Spanish Empire, she asked him about how much of control did he had over the island. And the answer is famous. It was not an invention. It's an official document of the Spanish government at that time. He said, "Your Majesty, the Spaniard soldier only control the piece of soil over which he is standing." That gives you a pretty objective description of the situation. The Americans troops intervened as a result of a very opportunistic approach. Jose Marti wrote articles, gave speeches, all of them exist, were published even at that time, in which he anticipated precisely that. They said they are going to wait until the moment they feel appropriate to come in and steal what was not their fighting, and steal away from the Cubans what the Cubans were already winning by themselves and for themselves. But it was the same with the Filipino people. Exactly what they did. And remember that they...
But unlike Puerto Rico, you did not become a colony of the United States.
For one reason. That is also a very sad, had a very sad result. In those days, in the 19th century, the two movements for independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico were in fact a single movement. They were together. There was a single party that led that effort. You read the papers that they publish in the U.S. You had there Martí was the director, but the chief of staff of the journal was a Puerto Rican, and they decided in their strategy were the two last colonies of Spain. As a matter of fact, it was a single colony, a single territory that was trying to achieve their independence from Spain. In Cuba, for different reasons, the struggle started in Cuba. And both Puerto Ricans and Cubans decided, tactically or strategically speaking, in those days, that it was better first to advance in the process of liberating the island of Cuba, and at a certain moment to move from Cuba to Puerto Rico. That was an internal matter of the Cuban and Puerto Rican people and the Spanish authorities. Then the Americans came in occupy Cuba and occupy Puerto Rico. At that moment, in Puerto Rico, we didn't have a large people's army as we had in Cuba, but in that army there were Puerto Rican generals, Puerto Rican colonels, Puerto Rican soldiers. It was none of their business. The Americans was our. Then that's one reason why in Cuba there has always existed a very strong sentiment of solidarity with Puerto Rico and the sense of a duty that we have in supporting their cause, because somebody else intruded into our life and separated us while we were part of the same process. Even the flag, why the flag is identical, has always been identical, just exchanging the place of the colors, to stress that there were two islands but a single movement. That was in those days. And you are right, Puerto Rico was occupied, was transformed into a U.S. colony, but a century after, it's high time to realize that Puerto Rico is not part of the United States, that it is a nation, a separate nation, an independent nation that is oppressed by the U.S. The U.S. didn't win the cultural war. Remember that at the beginning of the last century, when they occupied the island, even the language was forbidden. They tried to impose the English as the only language in Puerto Rico. And one century after, you may find Puerto Ricans who understand English, but nobody in that island, or even in the diaspora, the many Puerto Ricans who live outside their island, in particular in the U.S., Spanish. The Castilian language continued to be their language, even though it was not taught to an entire generation in their schools. That's one example. They feel they have a sense of nationhood that nobody can erase. It's they have, even Puerto Ricans have given examples to the rest of Latin America. We talk about the struggle against globalization and neoliberalism and so on. Well, the very first national strike that I remember against an effort to privatize a public enterprise took place in Puerto Rico, when the electrical service, utility, electrical and electricity and the telephone, the phone service, when they tried, that was years ago, they tried to privatize that corporation at a time that privatization was going on throughout the continent, throughout more developed nations in South America that had been independent for 2 centuries. And they did privatize even the water, even the air. Mr. Menem practically privatized the entire nation. But they couldn't do that in Puerto Rico because the people opposed, objected, and won that battle, as they won the battle for Vieques and the battle for Culebra before against the U.S. Army and so on. Then it's I would say, a peculiar example. On the one hand, the only nation in Latin America that has never achieved its independence, its political independence, and on the other hand, the best example of people's resistance and people's capability to win, even in the worst circumstances.
Well, I want to get on to independence and Cuba being one of those islands. And that's one of the things I'm looking at that is truly independent from the domination and the will of the United States, and especially United States corporation. Before I do that, I just want to go back to you and your position as the president of the National Assembly, and to tell us a little bit about what the National Assembly is, especially to an audience, many of whom doesn't have any knowledge of Cuba, or even in their own country having any contact with the government or the power establishment. We have a place like New York where you can say the municipal government and those who run it is not representative of the people. We have a billionaire as our mayor who bought this election. We have most of the people in the cabinets. When you look at them on television, my goodness, you wouldn't believe that you were in New York, because it doesn't reflect the multi-ethnic or the multicultural diversity of the city. So, tell us a little bit about the mechanics of your position and the body that you is the president of.
Well, it is a Cuban institution that is conceived from a Cuban starting point, our history, our tradition. It should be said that precisely because it was so difficult for us to obtain our independence from Spain, the Cuban and Puerto Rican independence movement was the last one to start in Latin America, at the time where the rest of the continent was already, or the Spanish-speaking territories, because there was also a British Empire that is forgotten in the bourgeois history usually. It began at a later stage, well advanced the 19th century, but precisely because of that, in certain respects, was different, completely different from what happened in South America. One example is that we have, in the Cuban case, we developed, or they developed, that generation of Cubans, political institutions and an organization over what was defined as the free territory of Cuba, and the areas in which the independence movement exercised control. Was not the entire island, but they, as they advanced, remember what the general said to the Queen, at the end, they only control the piece of ground over which their feet were standing. That's why we had not one, but 4 constitutions. We did establish a government, an administration over the liberated territories. We did have our own commune, thinking in terms of the Paris Commune, in Bayamo for almost 3 months in 1868 and the beginning of 69. The patriotic movement controlled that town, and Bayamo became the capital of a pretty large area of the Cauto Valley that was administered by the Cuban patriots. There, slavery was forbidden, for example, was the first movement or the first act of truly abolition of slavery in Cuba took place in that area. It was decreed as unlawful, and everybody was emancipated in that valley during the period of the Cuban control of the area. And they also established a system of government based on certain principles that are the same that we develop later. First of all, the the link between the representative and their people, the principle of recalling anybody, the principle of responsibility, of accountability in front of the electors. That system of government, that was established there, was really representative of the population of Bayamo. That's why, for the first time, a black person was member of the government. It was a three-man executive, one black person, one worker, somebody else who was I think it's a mason, could be said in English, the person who worked with bricks and in construction, then a mason, and another guy, somebody from that town, and they regularly reported to the people. The government of that area didn't take decisions without discussing the proposals openly in the public space in Bayamo. Was an original form of democracy that was ours. And then, when they established the first constitution, and in every other constitution, is another example, the Cubans choose to have not a two chambers system of legislation, but a single one, a national assembly. It was during the 20th century when the Americans intervened, and they introduced the American system, a House and a Senate. They projected over Cuba the kind of organization that the Americans had. But we had our own tradition. When the revolution triumphed and we established a single house, as was the case in Bayamo, as was the case from 1868 to 1898, for 30 years. Another example of the Cubanness of our system. We do not say that it is the best. Far from that. What we say is that it's truly democratic. I always remember what Pericles said about democracy when he was defending the system of government that existed in Athens, in his city-state. And I think that the definition given by him is still valid today. The oldest one and the most relevant. When he said, our society is a democracy, first of all, because we didn't import it from elsewhere. It streamed from our own society, our own system. Pericles, speaking in Greek, 2,500 years ago approximately. Second, because it's a system that works in the interest of the majority of the population. And third, because it's an organized system. It has institutions, it has laws. It's based on certain order, civilized order. Independence, originality, not being the result of alien or foreign imposition, work for the benefit of the majority, and all that reflected in a given organization. It's not anarchy. You can say exactly the same words regarding Cuba today. Perhaps with some additional ingredients. Pericles was referring to a society in which a majority of the population was a slave, were not considered citizens. He was right. He said that it worked in the benefit of the majority of the citizens. But in our case, we can say the same, with the difference that everybody is citizen. Nobody is excluded for race or economic reasons. Nobody is a slave. That leads to a number of differences between our National Assembly and other parliaments. In a way, we are, you want to have point of references in other experiences to understand a little better what we are. Well, the National Assembly is like the legislative power in other countries, but with a number of differences. The people, the representatives, the deputies in our case, are not representative or were not elected, were not nominated by an electoral party, a political party. So what? They didn't were nominated ever in our 30 years struggle. We didn't have parties. We just have one party, the Cuban Revolutionary Party, that didn't nominate the candidates. The candidates were nominated by the peoples or the people's organizations in the territory liberated from Spain. Then when we liberated the entire nation, we tried to develop a system based on our own roots instead of copying the what is done in other places. I do not say that everybody should have the same, because everybody doesn't have the same history. But that's one difference. Another difference is that we do not have professional representatives. In other words, the vast majority of our deputies are friends, are members, are colleagues who are at the same time a worker or a student or a journalist, or they have their own profession, their own activities that they continue to perform. And apart from that, they are also members of the National Assembly or a provincial assembly or a municipal assembly, because it's a national system.
So you have, let me understand this. So you have a number of assemblies going down to
169 local assemblies, because the republic is organized in municipalities, provinces, and the republic. 169 municipalities, 14 provinces, and 1 republic. At every level, you have an assembly of people's power where at each level they exercise a kind of legislative function, limited to, of course, the area in which they are operating. That's in a summary.
So what are some of the things that one could get done? What are some of the issues that one could bring up in these assembly? Building schools, paving roads. What are, I guess, levying taxes? I don't know. Regulating how land is developed. What do they do? I don't know.
Well, what this? ¿Qué pasó?
Plug it in the wall. Yeah. So.
Theoretically, those are issues that are discussed in parliaments around the world. Okay. You mentioned, for example, levying taxes. Well, we adopted in 1995 a tax system. We adopted a law that regulated that area. Well, I guess you have theoretically the same in other countries. What are the differences? we didn't adopt or approve that law by simply voting on a proposal submitted by the government. That happens every year in every country when you adopt the budget or adopt other measures of a national nature. We did have a very wide and prolonged process of discussions throughout the country based on our system, having all those assemblies everywhere, when in every municipality, in every neighborhood, in every factory, in every enterprise, we did have a discussion from which came what we may refer as a sort of consensus. For example, when we adopted that tax system, in the original draft presented by the administration, by the government, as is in every other place, they had included a tax on personal income, on the wage and salaries and so on. It was a big discussion. At the unions level, many unions objected. They simply said no. And that objection persisted all along that discussion. Others believed that that was proper to have that kind of taxation. At the end, at the National Assembly, the government was had to withdraw that chapter of the law because some of our comrades, particularly those coming from the union, deputies who are also union leaders, they said, no, my people in the many factories say no, they don't understand that, and so then it is not part of the law. And well, we have gotten some criticism from international experts who said, how can you have a universal social security system? Everybody had a guaranteed income even if he or she cannot work or when he or she retires. But how can you have that? The more ambitious program covering everybody and everything and not having recognized the principle that everybody should contribute to that system. That's a rather odd situation that may be very difficult to be understood elsewhere. But every time I am asked that, about that contradiction, my answer is very simple. It's democracy. Yeah, I disagree. As a member of the House, I told them, you are wrong. I think that we should have also that. It's a matter of principle, a concept. But if they do not want, if they were not prepared to accept that concept, the democratic result is that you cannot have that concept in our society as long as it is not agreeable by the ensemble of the society. It's a completely different idea of organization. I do not pretend to say, to project Cuba as the most democratic country that everybody else should follow and imitate, and no, that's not the point. I think that it is a truly democratic society because its system was not imported, it came from within, from our roots, and works in the interest of the majority. Those are the pillars of democracy from its conception, the original conception. And that means also that you have to be very creative, that you have to be constantly trying to improve, to be more efficient, more attuned with the interests of the nation and the people. And It's very simple to copy, to imitate somebody else. It's by far more challenging to develop from your own, to create, to be authentically Cuban.
Doctors for Brazil, Venezuela, Africa, and even the United States, the ability to educate a population to have that currency and to be a respected member of the international community. Now, in terms of Cuba development in the Caribbean, can you compare and contrast and probably give us some insight as to why in Cuba, for instance, Jamaica, which is 90 miles away, 140 kilometers, there's so many poor people. The International Monetary Fund actually control every aspect of the country. I think gasoline price is more expensive. You know, there are more hungry, homeless people there than here, and this is supposed to be the backward country, according to the neighbor to the north.
You mean who?
US. According to the US.
According to U.S., we are a backward country. Well, it depends on the final analysis. Is a matter of values. I remember Hillary Clinton when she was just the first lady at the very beginning of the first Clinton administration, when she was promoting the health care reform, the health care system. She said something that I quoted several times because I think it was a beautiful description of it. She said, you cannot have a country where 40 million people, which was the figure at that moment, doesn't have guaranteed health care attention. This government will be condemned if at the end we still have 40 million Americans deprived from health care. Well, you have the results there. After the two Clinton administration and the what happened afterwards, the so-called election of Mr. Bush and the so-called re-election of Mr. Bush, I think now it's above 45, 46 million. Many people around the world fail to understand why the country that is supposed to be the richest, the country that is supposed to be the most developed in certain respect, and in certain respect it is, at the same time you can have such a backward society. I don't know how can a person consider himself or herself a person that doesn't have the most elementary things guaranteed, probably would say, if you ask that person, no, I am living in a very backward country because I cannot educate my children easily, or I cannot go to a hospital or whatever. Those problems do not exist in our country, in our society. You may say, well, stores in Havana do not have the beautiful gadget that you can find in Manhattan and so on. So what? I lived there for 14 years, as I told you. To me, was difficult to assimilate at the beginning, that I could walk through beautiful avenues in front of beautiful stores in which I will never waste my time finding prices and so, because I couldn't, and I was ambassador. But what struck me more was to find people just sleeping in front of the most beautiful buildings or most rich places, or by the bridge of 59th Street, was the closest to my home, just a few blocks from Sutton Place, where only very, very rich people live. I could only walk on a Sunday afternoon through that area. I never imagined living in those buildings, but I used to walk with my wife and my daughter around that area to go to just to walk around. And when we saw the bridge and people living there, having the bridge construction as their only roof, and they were very privileged people, because others were just resting on the sidewalk. I used to walk also to the UN building. Sometimes it was very, very difficult to walk early in the morning because the sidewalk were simply occupied by people living there. And not only black people, not just Latinos, white, poor Americans, by the impressive numbers. A society that excludes human beings in itself deserves condemnation. Is the only, you cannot find that in nature. The only species that excludes from their community members of that species is the human species. Somebody said that it might be a mistake by God to have created the only species that work against itself and against nature, against God's work. You cannot find that among any other. You may find an animal that may fight another species or eat them. You have all these laws of nature, but you will never find in another creation of nature that irrational. In human, you don't have anti-dog attitude among dogs, or anti-cats among cats. You have anti-human. Only humans have developed war, exploitation, and so on. That's something to think about. What is to be done? But the only answer to that is revolution. It's the only until and unless humans are capable of establishing a humane society, we are risking even the annihilation of the species and of life on Earth. Those are facts. I don't know if to smile or to feel very sad when I listen or hear such descriptions of life that truly are simply and purely propaganda, very cheap propaganda. The very fact that capitalism has not succeeded in addressing human concerns and has not succeeded in more than 2 millennia to, to fulfill that old definition of the old guy from Athens, from Mr. Pericles, to have a society that serves the interests of the majority is the best answer to those who still now pretend to confuse people by repeating words, by manipulating concepts. We do not say that our society is perfect, far from there. We do believe in democracy, we do believe in the constant struggle for the betterment of life and the society, and we do believe in human solidarity. If what you said about Jamaica, for example, and it can be said of other Caribbean nations, we have to consider that against the background of exploitation that those societies suffer for for centuries. We have even a closest neighbor, our closest neighbor, which is Haiti. And this is the worst case scenario. But the Haitians have been perhaps the worst case of foreign subjugation and exploitation than any other case in history, and the most neglected one, the most ignored one. Remember that in the 18th century, when they started their War of Independence, they were described as the jewel of the Caribbean by the French. Was the most richest colony that existed at that time. For the French colonists, of course, for the rich people in France. When they revolted, they eliminated slavery. They established the first republic in this hemisphere. The very first democracy was the Haitian, but they had to face the aggression of all powers of the world. Why? Because for the first time, the former slaves had emancipated themselves, and they had been ignored, discriminated, generation after generation. It is now, with President Chavez, that for the first time, the Venezuelans are recognizing the role that the Haitian Republic played in supporting the independence movement in South America. Well, what can be done there? Send troops, as the UN did, serving the US purpose, or sending doctors. Cuba, now, at this very moment, we are proud to say that if there is a health system in Haiti, it's because of the Cubans. They couldn't, they do not have even the doctors. They do not have the hospital, they do not have the infrastructure, the most elementary thing. And well, Haiti was supposed to be one of the democratic regimes in the Western Hemisphere, according to the State Department rhetoric. And Cuba was supposed to be the only exception, the only non-democratic regime, according to the blah, 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 coming from Washington. But ask the Haitians, ask them if they really believe in that definition, or if they do not appreciate the significance of the cooperation that they had received from Cubans. Most of them, I repeat again, women.
Well, I think one difference between Cuba and Haiti is that Haiti have a constant 200 years of intervention. In the case of Cuba and the United States, while there have been aggression, and that's something I'm going to get to in a few moments with you, you have been pretty much left alone to develop without any assistance or interference directly from the United States to the extent that Haiti has suffered. So in a way, that may be a blessing, and that leads me to ask: is the United States irrelevant to the development of Cuba at this time? You know, you hear that the cars in Cuba are vintage United States cars, but when I look around, I see that you're doing health. It seems, based on your automobiles at least, that Toyota is here, Peugeot is here, Volvos are here, and all these other countries are here, and other industrial means of development or trade is going on with Cuba. Could, except for tourism, could the United States become irrelevant to Cuba and Cubans' development? Seems like you've worked around them, even in the area of food and agriculture. That is something I wanted to discuss with you.
Well, unfortunately, it is not yet irrelevant because the U.S. continues to have the policy of what they like to describe as embargo, economic embargo, which is something that goes much further than just a bilateral embargo. Every day you get the news about the consequences that we had to face due to that policy of economic warfare around the world. Those Cubans being expelled from a hotel in the center, the heart of the capital of a supposed to be sovereign country, Mexico, just because an order from Washington said, no, you cannot use that, that hotel because the owner of that hotel is an American company that had to obey by the U.S. law. The other day, we had signed an agreement with a French company for the acquisition of airplanes that we need for our international communications. That was fine. Everything was fine, except that suddenly the French company was bought by an American company, and they simply break the contract because on orders from Washington and so on. But you mentioned the cars. You said that you can see here Toyotas and the other brands, and you can see them also in the States. Yeah. And last month, I was struck by some breaking news when I arrived in Caracas. I remember very well. When I arrived in Caracas, I turned on the TV set of the hotel room, and they were having a breaking news. The chairman of the board of the Ford Motors company was making a public statement. They convened a press conference to announce that from that moment, 30,000 U.S. workers will be out of work, and that they were closing down 14 car plants in the country. A month before, the guy from the General Motors made a similar announcement. More or less the same amount of workers out of work and the same amount of plants being closed down. That's a symbol of American culture and economy, cars. And if you keep watching TV, American TV, you probably would have found an ad from Toyota or from Hyundai, from other companies that are competing inside the US. That reminds me that globalization is not just a problem for the third world. It's not for the poor countries, but also for the poor people in the US. And that struck me particularly because of this concept of democracy. After the breaking news, some interviews were made with workers of some of those factories. And it was really scandalous to me. They learned what happened to them the same manner that I did. They learned by TV, by breaking news. Nobody consulted them. Nobody discussed with them. No negotiation with any union. And they gave the same answer. I do not know what will be my life, what will be my children's future, and so on and so forth. That's democracy. Tell that to the old man in Athens, that a person can learn that his life or her life is being completely affected by unknown forces, unknown decisions in which you cannot participate in any manner. In this backward country of Cuba, 10 years ago, as I told you before, when we were facing a very severe economic crisis, we didn't take a single measure. We had to close down some plants. We had to reduce the labor force in certain areas. Not anymore. Now it's the reverse. Now we have practically full employment in this country in just 10 years. Precisely because of that. Precisely because of democracy. We discuss with everybody at every corner of the country. I had attended personally dozens of workers' assembly in which, in those days, they democratically discussed and voted who was going to be laid off, because they couldn't continue having the same number of workers at the particular moment. I repeat, that's something of our past. Now, if you go to the same factory, you will see that they are not just recovered production, but they have increased. In our concept, it is impossible to take such decisions without the consent of those suffering from those decisions. In capitalism, especially as it is now in this phase of its development, is part of the system, and nobody went to the streets to depose that undemocratic regime. It's normal that you learn via TV that you are out of work after having worked in that plant for a whole generation, perhaps. Is that democracy? No, it's the opposite. It's the dictatorship of capital that has been imposed throughout the world, with a few exceptions, such as this country, this backward, because doesn't follow that rule. And we are very proud of that difference. And I hope, I believe that someday, as in the Lennon's lyrics, someday you will join us, and then the world will be different.
Now, in terms of the United States aggression against 5 minutes, okay, against Cuba, there are 5 men who were arrested and according to court in the United States, unjustly tried and convicted. That used to be called lynching in the old days, of being spies for the United States. Could you tell me why you feel those men should not have been, first of all, convicted or even tried in the first place, and they should be returned to their family? In addition to that, I think earlier in the week, you hoisted 138 black flags with white stars in front of the United States intersection. And you've also was mentioned that a number of individuals in the thousands have died as a direct results of United States aggression. I think you characterize it as terrorism. Is that truly an accurate characterization of what terrorism is? And what do you say to that?
Well, the problem is that the U.S. The ruling classes exercise a tremendous influence and control over the big media. That's why perhaps many Americans do not know or are not aware of the fact that the U.S. government itself has described that as terrorism. Just to give you an example, a very concrete example. When George W.H. Bush was president of your country in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, Mr. Orlando Bosch, the head of one, perhaps the most notorious terrorist groups in the anti-Cuban terrorist groups operating in America, was described in an official document issued and signed by the acting U.S. Attorney General of Mr. Bush as being not just a terrorist, but the most notorious one in the Western Hemisphere. You don't have to believe me. You just visit the website of the Justice Department and you will find a document, a determination by the acting Attorney General of Mr. Bush, father, June 1989, describing Mr. Bush as one of the worst terrorists that ever existed, with a lot of information that they said that they had and they have. That man was admitted into the U.S. by Bush father, has been living in Miami freely. Last year, new U.S. official documents from CIA, from FBI, from the State Department were declassified. For the first time, it was revealed that that guy, who is now living freely in Miami, participated, according to U.S. documents. You don't have to believe me, but you can visit and learn and read those documents. One of those documents referred that in June 1976, there was a meeting in Santiago de Chile, at that time was Pinochet, in which Mr. Bush, convened by Mr. Bush, with the DINA, the police, political apparatus, police apparatus of political repression in Chile, who killed thousands of people. Mr. Bush, DINA people, and Guillermo Novo Sampol from New York met there, and I will quote from the document, the decision was taken to assassinate Orlando Letelier, who was a Chilean refugee living in Washington. June, 3 months after what happened, on September the 21st, he was killed. He was assassinated in Washington as a result of that decision taken in Santiago de Chile. Guillermo Novo Sampol was accused, was indicted as the man who put the bomb in the car that killed Letelier, and a young American, by the way, Ronnie Moffett, a young woman who was destroyed, physically destroyed by the bomb. Another document by the U.S. government, now declassified, said that in the last week of September of 1976, that year, a few days after Letelier's assassination, there was a public celebration in Caracas in which Mr. Bush made a speech in which he very proudly, quote unquote, recognized how well done was the Letelier operation and announced something else. In that document, official U.S. document, the officials of the U.S. government said that at that very meeting, Luis Posada Carriles, who was there, described what Bush had announced as a plan to destroy a Cuban civilian airplane. And he said, now we are going to destroy a Cuban airplane. Bush knows the details. A few days later was the destruction of our plane near Barbados. Where is Mr. Bush now? Free in Miami. Where is Mr. Posada now? Protected by the Bush, the second, in an immigration facility in El Paso, Texas. Where is Fernando González? Fernando González is serving a 19 years old term. His only accusation was to have penetrated Mr. Bush group. Which side is Mr. Bush on the struggle against terrorism? Obviously, together with the most notorious terrorist in the Western Hemisphere, a guy that was never even interviewed by the FBI, notwithstanding the fact that they knew that they had planned a terrorist attack in Washington, D.C., the heart of Washington, D.C., in which an American woman was killed. This September will be the 30th anniversary of that act. The assassins are at large, and those who try to oppose them are incarcerated. They should, the five should have never been even arrested. That is the conclusion of the Human Rights Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. That the whole thing from December the 12th, 1998 until now was arbitrary and contrary to the law. That was also the determination by a panel of judges from Atlanta who decided to reverse their convictions. If your conviction at a lower level is reversed, nullified, that means that you are innocent. There can only be two possibilities. Either you are found guilty or not guilty. If you are found not guilty, how on earth can you be for 8 years in a maximum security prison, as the five are now, just because they oppose terrorism? Terrorism that has been tolerated, protected by some U.S. administrations, particularly the Bushes, father and son, and brother of the son of the same father. Then I think that this is a very, very clear situation. It was said, recognized by the U.S. government from the first indictment against them, all along the trial in Miami, and even in the sentences of those people, that the problem with them was that they penetrated terrorist groups that are protected by the U.S. government. That should be a source of scandal in a democratic society. That's why they managed to close completely this issue from public views. That's with the connivance or the cooperation of subservient media that help them in hiding the truth and helping a government that by his own definition is a terrorist regime. Remember, one of the phrases that Mr. Bush Jr. has repeated more frequently is those who protect a terrorist, those who lodge a terrorist, those who help a terrorist are as guilty as the terrorists. Well, that's exactly the definition of the Bushes. That's why I said that the big problem that we're facing with the five friends that are in prison is that how to let the American people know the truth about this case. That's very difficult because the truth about this case proves that you are living under a terrorist regime. It's as simple as that. The same terrorist regime that had manipulated very opportunistically the abominable, the heinous acts of terrorism that the American people suffered on in September 2001, and have done what you know: war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, sending people to kill and be killed in the name of fighting something that they do not fight. They have been always, this particular regime, very closely connected with the most criminal groups of terrorists in this hemisphere and elsewhere. Because after all, Mr. Bin Laden was also their Posada Carriles in another period. The Taliban were their protected friends in another time. And they still now have this double standard attitude that can only be defeated by disseminating the truth and educating people. That's why I insist, don't believe me. I tell to your listeners, read the documents, read their documents, read what has been declassified, and especially read that old report, not that old, 1989, of the Justice Department of Mr. Bush, describing those groups as terrorists that should not have a place in America, but they have a place, a privileged one, because they are very close to the Bushes.
On that note, I want to thank you very much for granting this interview, Mr. Ricardo Alarcon. Thank you.
No, I want to thank you and also to everybody that may be listening to this interview, and I was really very glad to have this opportunity talking with you. Thank you.